Elara was a widow. That was her name in the town of Prospect Creek. Not Elara, just the widow. Her husband, James, had been a mining engineer, a man who understood rock and pressure and the deep, slow breathing of the earth. He had died 2 years prior, leaving her with 3 things of value: a strong-backed Clydesdale horse named Copper, a small, wind-swept plot of land on the north edge of town, pressed against the base of Old Man's Ridge, and 12 leather-bound journals filled with his precise, elegant script. For a year, she did nothing. She grieved. She read the journals. She read them not for sentiment, but for instruction. James had not written poetry. He had written of geothermal gradients, of thermal mass and hydrostatic pressure. He had filled pages with calculations on load-bearing arches and the R-value of packed earth versus winter snow. He had spent a decade planning a structure he never had the chance to build. A house not built upon the earth, but within it. In the second spring after his death, Elara made her decision. She hitched Copper to a plough and did not break the soil for planting. She broke it at the base of the ridge, marking the outline of a foundation that made no sense to anyone who saw it. It was long and narrow, facing due south. She went to the town hall on a Tuesday. Mayor Thompson sat behind a large oak desk, a man whose substance was measured in speeches and handshakes. Elara, in her plain wool dress, laid a single page from her husband's journal on his desk. It was a cross-section drawing. "I am notifying you of my intent to build," she said. Her voice was quiet, unused to public spaces. The mayor glanced at the drawing. He squinted. "What is this? A root cellar?" "It is a dwelling," Elara replied. "Dug into the hillside, earth-sheltered." Mayor Thompson leaned back, a smile playing on his lips. "My dear woman," he began, the condescension a thick syrup in his voice. "We have building codes in Prospect Creek. We build proper houses, with foundations and frames and clapboard siding, not burrows." "The design is sound," Elara stated. "It uses the thermal mass of the hill to maintain a stable temperature year-round. It will be impervious to the wind and the deep freezes." The mayor chuckled. "The deep freezes are why we have furnaces and cordwood, not why we live like badgers. The town council cannot approve a permit for a hole in the ground." "I am not asking for a permit," Elara said, retrieving the drawing. "I am providing a notification." She turned and walked out. The story was all over town by suppertime. The quiet widow had finally lost her mind. Dr. Aris Thorne heard it while making his rounds. He was a man of science, a graduate of an Eastern college, and he believed in circulation. The circulation of air, of blood, of modern ideas.
"A subterranean dwelling?" he scoffed to the postmaster.
"It's a recipe for consumption. Damp, stagnant air, full of humours and disease. The woman will be dead in a year from lung rot." Silas Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, heard the news while overseeing the framing of his new barn. It was a magnificent structure, 200 feet long, with a soaring gambrel roof and a fieldstone foundation that had cost a fortune.
"Digging a home?" Croft bellowed with laughter, slapping his foreman on the back. "Why would anyone dig for a home when they can build one that scrapes the sky? Tell her when the wind blows her dirt pile down, she can come work in a real building." The mockery settled over Elara like a fine dust. Her project was given a name: Elara's Folly. Children would walk past her land on their way to the fishing hole, chanting it. "Elara, Elara, digging a grave. Elara's Folly, not a home to be saved."
At the general store, when someone made a particularly poor decision, the phrase was born. "Don't go pulling an Elara," they would say, and everyone would laugh. Elara heard it all. She did not react. She simply worked. The first day, she and Copper began to dig. The plough broke the topsoil. Then came the shovels. Then the picks. Day after day, the rhythm was the same. Sunrise. Hitch Copper to the stone boat, a heavy sled for dragging away earth and rock. Dig. Pry. Shovel. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain. She was not merely digging a hole, she was following a plan. James's journals were her Bible, her blueprint. The entrance was a deep, U-shaped trench, a cold sink designed to trap the heaviest, coldest air and keep it from the inner door. She dug 10 feet down before she even began the main chamber. The town watched, amused.
"Looks like she's digging to China," the blacksmith remarked.
The first summer passed. The trench was complete. She had hit bedrock. Now the real work began. Using a star drill and a sledgehammer, she began to bore holes into the rock face. Tap, tap, turn. Tap, tap, turn. It was a sound that echoed across the low pasture, a tiny, metallic heartbeat. Hours to drill a single 6-inch hole. Then she would pack it with unslaked lime, pour in water, and hammer in a wooden plug. The pressure would build slowly, silently. Hours later, a sharp crack would split the air as a slab of rock broke free. She and Copper would haul the slab away on the stone boat. It was brutal, mind-numbing labor. Her hands became calloused, then split, then calloused over again. Her back was a knot of constant aching pain. But her husband's voice was in the journals. The south face absorbs the winter sun. The north face bears the storm. Build into the south face. She obeyed. The walls must be smooth, no sharp angles for the frost to grip. She spent an entire winter smoothing the interior rock walls with a chisel and hammer until they felt like worn river stones. The second year began. The main chamber was a hollowed-out cavern, 40 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 10 feet high. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the freeze arrives. Now she had to build within the hole. She used the rock she had excavated to build the interior walls, leaving a 2-foot gap between her new wall and the cold earth of the hill. This, the journal explained, was the key, the thermal break. The air in that gap, insulated by tons of earth on one side and the dwelling on the other, would remain at a near constant 50 degrees. She built a floor raised 1 foot off the rock bed and a heavy timbered roof. She needed lumber. She went to the mill. The owner smirked. "Building a roof for your hole, Elara? I need 60 beams, 16 feet long." He charged her double the usual rate. She paid in cash from the small inheritance James had left. She and Copper hauled the beams, one by one. The town saw the horse, ribs showing from the strain, and they shook their heads. "She's going to kill that animal," Silas Croft declared from the seat of his new buggy. "All for a mad woman's whim." He had just taken delivery of 1,000 panes of glass for the long walls of his new barn. It gleamed on the far side of the valley, a palace for his prize-winning cattle. Elara laid the beams. On top, she laid thick planking. Then came the layers of insulation, just as James had sketched. A layer of tar paper, a layer of compacted straw, another layer of tar paper, and finally, 3 feet of the excavated earth, which she painstakingly hauled up a ramp and spread evenly across the roof. She planted the sod with the native grasses of the ridge. By the end of the second summer, the structure had vanished. It looked as though the hill had simply grown a small, grassy mound at its base. Only the dark opening of the cold sink trench was visible. The third year was for the details. She built 2 narrow ventilation shafts lined with stone that snaked up through the earth and exited 100 feet up the hill, disguised as small piles of rock. One for intake, one for exhaust. They created a slow, constant draw of fresh air, powered by the heat from within. Dr. Thorne would have been impressed, had he known. But he only saw the dank hole and preached his sermons on ventilation to anyone who would listen. Elara installed a small, efficient soapstone stove, its flue pipe running through the exhaust shaft, warming the outgoing air to increase the draw. She built shelves into the walls, and she began to stock them. For 1,000 days she had dug. Now she prepared. Her garden was 3 times its normal size. All summer she harvested, canned, and preserved. Rows and rows of glass jars filled the shelves. Beans, corn, tomatoes, pickles. She dried apples and plums until they were leathery and sweet. She filled sacks with flour, sugar, salt, and oats. She bought 200 pounds of dried pinto beans. The store owner winked at the man next in line. "Feeding an army down there, Elara?" "Something like that," she said quietly. She spent a month chopping wood, splitting logs, until her arms screamed with fatigue. She stacked it not outside, but in a dry, stone-lined alcove just inside the entrance, enough to last a winter. Or 2. The work was done. It was the end of September, in the 3rd year, day 990. The mockery had faded, not from acceptance, but from boredom. Elara's folly was just a part of the landscape now, a curiosity that had lost its novelty. Then the signs began. She saw them because her husband had taught her to see. He had not just been an engineer of rock, but an observer of the world that lived upon it. First, it was the squirrels. They were gone. The normally frantic, chattering horde that stripped the oaks bare was silent. The trees on the ridge were still heavy with acorns. The squirrels had vanished. Then the geese. They flew south a full month early, not in their usual lazy V-shaped formations, but in a panicked, silent mass that darkened the sky for an hour and was gone. Elara stood outside her burrow, watching them go, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The pine marten, a creature she usually saw only as a flash of brown fur at dusk, became bold. She saw them in broad daylight, their movements jerky and desperate, killing rabbits and leaving them uneaten. There was a stillness settling over the valley. The air lost its scent of pine and damp earth. It began to smell of nothing. A clean, cold, metallic smell, like a knife blade held to the tongue. The final sign came on the morning of day 1000, October 28th. She woke to an absolute silence. No birdsong, no insect hum. The world was holding its breath. She looked at the barometer James had insisted she mount by the door. The needle had fallen so far it was pressed against the retaining pin at the bottom of the dial. She had never seen it do that. James's journal had a chapter on it. When the animals fall silent and the glass falls off the wall, nature is preparing for an act of war. Elara worked with a calm, deliberate efficiency. She brought Copper into his own prepared stall, a small, attached cavern she had dug for him, with a winter's supply of hay and oats. She filled the last of her water barrels from the small, spring-fed cistern she had built at the back of the dwelling. She checked the seals on the heavy inner door, a massive thing of oak and iron she had built herself. She considered, for a moment, walking into town. She could go to the mayor's office. She could tell him what was coming. She imagined his face. the condescending smile, the patient sigh. She imagined Dr. Thorne explaining away the signs with a rational, scientific dismissal. She imagined Silas Croft laughing, telling her the sky was not going to fall on his magnificent barn. They had mocked her for 1,000 days. They would not listen to her on day 1001. Her warning would be just another story of the mad widow's folly. So she said nothing. She lit a single lantern, closed the heavy outer door to the cold sink, and then sealed the thick, insulated inner door. A heavy iron bar dropped into place with a solid, final thud. The silence was now complete. Outside, the world waited. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people. The catastrophe did not arrive gently. It came on October 29th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It came not as weather, but as a physical blow.
The wind struck the valley like a fist, a single concussive force that shook houses on their foundations. The sky, which had been a strange, pale grey, turned instantly to white. It was not snow. It was a horizontal blizzard of ice crystals, driven by 100-mile-an-hour wind. They called it the White Death. Within the first hour, the temperature dropped 50 degrees, from a brisk autumn 40 degrees to 10 below zero. The windows on the north side of every building in Prospect Creek shattered, exploding inward as if hit with buckshot. The wind screamed through the town, a constant, demonic howl. Silas Croft was in his new barn, admiring his prize bull, when the storm hit. He heard the sound of 1,000 panes of glass disintegrating at once. The wind ripped through the vast open space, tearing sheets of metal roofing from their nails and sending them spinning into the white maelstrom. He tried to get his cattle into the lower pens, but it was too late.
The cold was a living thing. It killed with shocking speed. By nightfall, the temperature was 40 below zero. The snow began then. Not crystals, but heavy, wet flakes that fell with terrifying speed, driven by the unabated wind. The town's power, generated by a water wheel on the creek, had failed in the first hour when the creek froze solid. People huddled in their homes, stuffing blankets into broken windows, feeding wood into stoves that could not keep up with the cold. The very wood of their houses groaned and cracked in the freeze. By the second day, the snow was 4 feet deep. By the third day, it was 10 feet deep. It did not stop. The proud 2-story homes of Prospect Creek became single-story homes. Then they became mounds. The supply train from the east was overdue. It had not arrived. It would not arrive. Sometime on the 4th day, the great roof of Silas Croft's magnificent barn, burdened with 10 feet of impossibly heavy snow, gave way. It collapsed with a sound that no one heard over the roar of the wind, crushing everything inside. The town's water tower, a proud metal cylinder on spindly legs, froze solid. The ice expanded, and the tower split its seams with a great metallic groan. Prospect Creek was cut off. It was paralyzed. It was dying. And 16 feet beneath the surface of the snow, in Elara's folly, a lamp burned with a steady, golden light. The air was 65 degrees. Elara sat at her small wooden table, mending a sock. The storm was a distant, muffled hum. A background noise, no more threatening than a faraway train. Copper was warm and fed in his stall. The soapstone stove radiated a gentle, constant heat, consuming only a few logs a day. The air was fresh, drawn down from the buried intake shaft, circulated by the stove's heat, and expelled. She had food. She had water. She had light.
She had warmth. She had peace. For 7 days, the storm raged without pause. Elara kept a calendar, marking off the days. She read her husband's journals again, this time with a deep, profound sense of gratitude. She cooked. She slept. She listened to the faint, dull roar of the world ending above her. On the 8th day, she heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, scrabbling noise at the outer door. She paused, listening. It was followed by a weak, desperate pounding. She took her lantern and walked down the short hall to the inner door. She lifted the heavy iron bar and pulled it open. The cold that hit her from the entrance trench was staggering. It was a physical wall of cold, so intense it burned her lungs. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked to the outer door. She had to shove against a drift of fine snow that had blown into the trench. When she opened it, a figure fell inward, collapsing onto the stone floor. It was a man, covered in ice, his face a mask of frostbite. She dragged him inside, away from the deadly air of the trench, and slammed the door shut. She brought him into the main chamber and laid him near the stove. As she brushed the ice from his face, she recognized him. It was Dr. Aris Thorne. His lips were blue, cracked. "Lung rot," he whispered, his voice a dry rattle. Then he lost consciousness. Elara did not say a word. She treated his frostbite. She wrapped him in blankets. When he woke, hours later, she gave him a bowl of warm broth. He drank it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the bowl. He looked around the warm, dry, well-lit space. He saw the rows of food. He saw the calm, steady woman who had saved him. He began to weep, deep, shuddering sobs of a man whose entire world of belief had been shattered. He was the first. He was not the last. He had survived because his house was small and his woodpile was close. He had spent a day tunneling through the snow, following the memory of the ridgeline, praying he was going the right way. He told her others were trying to dig out, to consolidate in the town hall, but they were running out of food. They were running out of wood. They were running out of hope. 2 days later, they started to arrive. A procession of the humbled. The postmaster and his family of 4. The blacksmith, his hands wrapped in rags, his wife suffering from a hacking cough. They came in 1s and 2s, ghosts stumbling out of a white hell into a warm, quiet heaven. Elara took them all in. She gave them no speeches. She offered no words of vindication. She simply opened her door and gave them sanctuary. The small dwelling became crowded. People slept on the floor, in every available space. Elara became their leader, not by choice, but by necessity. She organized them. She rationed the food, her vast stores now feeding 30 souls. She rationed the water. She maintained order with her quiet, unshakable calm. The derogatory name for her home died on their frozen lips. They were inside Elara's folly, and it was the only thing keeping them alive. If Bum has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Hit that hype button if you haven't already. The last to arrive came on the 15th day of the storm. The digging party had finally reached them. 2 men at the edge of death in the ruins of the town hall. They were carried in, barely conscious. One was Mayor Thompson, his face a grey, sunken ruin. The other was Silas Croft. The wealthy rancher, the man who was going to scrape the sky, was broken. He had lost everything. His barn, his cattle, his pride. He had survived by burning the expensive furniture from his mansion, room by room.
Elara looked down at the two men who had been her chief mockers, the civic authority and the wealthy skeptic. She felt nothing. No pity, no triumph.
She simply instructed the blacksmith to find them a space on the floor. The storm raged for another week, 21 days in total. Then, one morning, the silence changed. The deep, oppressive hum of the wind was gone. After 2 more days, Elara and the blacksmith dug their way up through the entrance trench. They emerged into a world they did not recognize. There was no town. There was only a vast, rolling ocean of white under a brilliant, cold sun. The tops of a few roofs and chimneys poked through the snow like lonely, forgotten gravestones. The air was 20 degrees below zero. Survival was still measured in hours, but the war was over. The reckoning came a month later. The survivors, gaunt and hollow-eyed, gathered in the largest chamber of Elara's dwelling, the only space large enough to hold them. Mayor Thompson stood before them. He was a changed man, stripped of his bluster and his easy smiles. He looked at the faces in the lantern light.
He looked at Elara, who stood at the back, watching. "I have failed you," he said, his voice cracking. "As a mayor, and as a man. I put my faith in what I thought was progress, in proper ways and established codes." He paused, gathering himself. "I led the chorus of fools who mocked the one person who tried to show us a better way. We were proud. We were arrogant. We called her wisdom folly." He turned to face Elara directly. "You were right," he said, the words a clear admission in the quiet room. "We were wrong." Then Dr. Thorne stood up. "My science was a shield for my own ignorance," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I spoke of health and circulation, but I did not understand the health of the earth itself. Her design was not unhealthy. It was the only healthy thing in this entire valley. She saved my life, and she saved all of you. I was wrong." Finally, Silas Croft, leaning heavily on a crude crutch, pushed himself forward. He did not look at anyone. He stared at the stone floor. "I built with pride," he whispered. "I built for show. I thought strength was in size and expense. I laughed at her. I laughed while she was digging her salvation, and I was building my tomb." He looked up, and his eyes met Elara's. "You were right," he said, the words costing him everything. "We were all so terribly wrong." The apology hung in the air. It was complete. It was absolute. Elara stepped forward. The crowd parted for her. She looked at the humbled men, at the hopeful faces of the survivors. "Your pride did not cause the storm," she said, her voice even and calm. "It only prevented you from surviving it. Nature does not care about our opinions. It only rewards preparation." She looked around the room, at the community that now lived in her home. "The lesson is not that I was right. The lesson is in the earth. It is in the wind. It is in the animals. The knowledge is there, if you are humble enough to listen." "Will you teach us?" the blacksmith's wife asked. "Will you show us how to rebuild, how to live?" Elara nodded slowly. "I will teach you," she said. They rebuilt Prospect Creek, but they did not rebuild it as it was. The first new structure was not a house, but a communal dwelling, built into the same ridge as Elara's, using her methods and her guidance. They dug. They learned the slow, patient work of the drill and the sledgehammer. They learned about thermal breaks and ventilation and the power of the earth. The phrase, pulling an Elara, was reborn. It came to mean an act of profound foresight, of quiet, stubborn wisdom in the face of popular opinion. To build your house well, to stock your pantry full, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. That was pulling an Elara.
Elara herself never fully rejoined the community. She had become something other than a neighbor. She was a sage. She lived in her burrow, her folly, for another 40 years. People came to her not for idle chat, but for advice. They brought her their plans for a new home, their questions about a strange blight on their crops, their worries about a dry season. She would listen, and she would consult the worn leather journals of her husband, and she would give them the quiet, unvarnished truth of the earth. She never married again. She lived her long life in the steady, peaceful solitude she had earned under 1,000 tons of rock and soil. She died in her sleep on a warm spring morning at the age of 87. The town she had saved, now a thriving community of earth-sheltered homes, mourned her with a profound and quiet respect. They did not bury her in the town cemetery. They buried her on the grassy mound of her own roof, on the hill above the home that had been her crucible and her salvation. They marked the spot not with a cross, but with a simple bronze plaque set in a field stone. Its inscription was short. It read, "Elara, she saw the truth in the earth. The rest of us learned to see it in the snow."